So I guess we can get started. First thing I want to say is thanks for coming. I got some. First want to say thank you for coming. And the other thing I want to say is I don't expect you to believe anything I say. But I'm going to put out some information and ideas for your consideration. But I encourage you to do your own research and thinking. And I did bring some basic resources that you can take pictures of in case you want to get them. Most of the presentation this evening is going to be based on this book, published in 1975. And what I'm going to say to you tonight, this is almost out of print. You can still find some copies around, but to me, this is the single most important book ever written about American government. Because it talks about the philosophy and the ideas and the motivations all mixed together. Not just the ideas, but also the practical motivations that came together to create the preamble. What I'm going to say here is I stumbled across this idea 14 years ago while I was doing research in economics. I was doing a comparative study of socialist, capitalist, and mixed economies. And it dawned on me that, wait a minute, the preamble sort of does the same thing in terms of integrating the best features of all types of those economies. So then I started to look around for books that would explain that view of the preamble, and this one is the only one I could find. So, based on that, there's some other resources you can use if you want to do more in-depth study. But I ended up writing a book about this myself, and in the end, on the bottom of the second page, I list it as a resource. But I also want to say that I'm not selling books. If you want one, just let me know, I'll give you one. You don't have to, I'm not trying to sell books. And if anyone wants to do further study on this, I'll be happy to. So just let me know. I have a new preamble email address for this topic. It's called thepreamblematters@gmail.com. The reason I said that was what I'm going to tell you tonight. I never learned in school at all. It was never taught, either in high school or college. This understanding of the preamble, I didn't learn in school. And I don't think it's taught in schools. But to me, it's the essence and crux of what ended up being our Constitution. It's the ideas and values that generated the Constitution. And I think, as I recall from a civics class, they used to have civics classes in high school. It was like, well, then there's the preamble, and then you have the three branches of government in the Constitution. But it was like the preamble didn't matter. And my study tells me it's the single most important thing in our history. Like, you can't make this stuff up. It's like people talking about the Bible, but they've never read it. So I'm not complaining, it's an observation. So what I would like to do is open up with some discussion of the maze, and then I would like to read to you. I don't want to insult your intelligence, but I want to read to you this first, the preamble, and then the observations and some implications. I want to read it kind of slowly because if you're like me, it's when you're hearing an unfamiliar idea for the first time. Did any of you learn about in depth about the preamble in school? No.
I was required to memorize.
Yeah, but was there a discussion about what it means? Yeah. Okay. So I'd want to do some reading to you and with some observations thrown in, and then we'll have some time for open discussion. Okay?
Okay.
Okay.
That's my nephew, Aaron. He, the poor fellow, you see a resemblance?
Yeah.
He's been struggling with that his whole life.
It's hard to live up to.
I know. Kojak thing.
Diplomat. So let's spend a few minutes talking about, I use the term maze, that US politics is kind of like a maze now. So let me start with the first question. How would you describe our current politics? Are we united or divided?
Clearly divided.
Divided and balkanized.
We're united in that we're all
What are some of the differences in purposes, beliefs, and values that are dividing us today?
People with loud mouths.
Yeah?
Because when you actually start talking to people, I know not always that far apart.
Oh, is that right? Okay. All right.
But what's
Yeah.
in our hearts.
So there's some similarities and some differences?
Yep.
Okay.
I think there's a sort of attitude, there's a certain general attitude of defensiveness, of being one person against the world, of holding on to what I already have and protecting it from other people, and another attitude of feeling things aren't right unless everybody's okay.
Okay.
That's real basic and real general.
Exclusive versus inclusive?
Yes, I think that's what I find, me, mine versus, community.
Uh-huh. Okay. Rob, you had your,
I have one crazy Trump person that I sample from every once in a while, and then I report back on. Truth seems to be not a factor, it's sort of unknowable, although she believes what she believes. But I go to the court system, I mean, they bring out facts that are ruled inadmissible or not admissible, stuff like that. And completely off the table, can't count that at all, means nothing. I don't know where you actually go from that, but.
yeah. The rules of evidence are not in the public discourse.
Yeah. I've got 5 that come up off mine. One is basically religious and an avoidance based on religious assumption, which is more like a wall for some people and permeable for others. Class, which seems to be physical division primarily. Even if you're in the same town, the class division seems to operate throughout the life cycle, pretty much anything beyond age of 3 or 4. You're told who you can and can't play with, all the way to who you end up graduating and doing business with. So those walls are in place. Ethnic, which is usually not too bad a division after the second generation, but it still creates a new division. If people over-hearken to their ethnicity, it can be wedged. That's a division form. And then what you're saying is the individualism. We have this bizarre global extreme of individualism, which is in our mythology, that individuals do everything, whether it's invent things, build things, create wealth, everything. It's like one guy did it all by himself. And it's a weird kind of, I think it distorts our
Okay.
That's what I got, and business is the other one.
Trey?
I've got a question rather than a comment. The question is, what are the differences in purposes, beliefs, and values? And people talked about beliefs and values, but I don't understand your question about purposes and what are some of the differences in purposes that you see? I'm not quite understanding that.
My experience in doing counseling and psychotherapy is that we have purposes that we've absorbed from our culture, not even explicitly, but they're still in our mind somewhere as being things we need to do or things we want to do that we haven't really thought about rationally. So that's a part of the motivation. And
I think what the Democrats and the Republicans have in common is that they overlook greater purposes that are in our preamble for the purpose of winning. So winning is the purpose they have in common, which is wisdom in itself.
interesting, 2,500 years ago, a guy named Socrates drew a distinction between sophistry and philosophy. Sophistry is about learning how to make arguments to win. Philosophy is a desire to search for truth. And because he brought that to the attention of the Athenian public, that group agreement does not equal truth, he was sentenced to death.
Yes, it must have cost him his life.
Because that upset a lot of apple carts. It's like going to college so you can get a job versus going to college because you want to learn. So these are pretty big differences in purpose that are in our culture and have been for the last 2,500 years.
Well, I've heard, just sitting, somebody could blah, blah, blah on TV, simply blame liberals for everything, when they're not to have anything to do with it. I mean, if it's bad, it must be the liberal did it. Even if liberal had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
It didn't even happen in this country.
Well, one of the things I've noticed is that part of the problem is in resolving our conflicts is that politics is now very big business. In other words, a lot of people would lose a lot of money if we resolve our conflicts. Half of the cable channels will be out of business. Donation business, fear drives donations. Not necessarily noble, but people will donate to things out of fear more than they will out of a genuine, moral, virtuous approach.
Someone, yeah, I just heard this today. Someone, I asked him how things are going at work, and there are a lot of, conservatives where she works. And she said, well, what I tell people is that if there weren't two parties, you wouldn't have anybody to argue with.
Yeah, you'd miss all that profit.
You wouldn't have anyone else to blame.
But it's big business. Billions and billions of dollars go into campaigns now. And I have, one question I have is, how did we get to the point where the person who raises the most money is probably going to win the election? What's that about?
Citizens United.
More recently, yeah.
It's almost, it goes along with the rising.
Essentially legalized bribery.
Yeah, that's true too, yeah.
It's essentially, that's what it is, it's legalizing, you pay your
Yeah,
congressman, vote for whoever you want.
yeah. Well, let me ask the next question then. What do children think and feel about what they see and hear in our politics today? Do you think they feel safe? Or might they feel anxious and sad because of what they see and hear going on?
I know this diehard Trump supporter who likes telling me that kids are getting into fights in the playground because their parents are of different political beliefs, like Trump versus Biden. And that's terrible. The parents are sending that to the kids are fighting over it.
Anybody can imagine too what children might be thinking of this maze?
That there's an enemy out there,
Hmm.
that there's an enemy out there they have to fear.
Oh,
Yeah, I am bummed. I invited, there are 2 civics teachers at Berkeley Springs High School, by the way, who I invited to come and to encourage their students to come tonight. And NEPA are here, so I would have, not raising kids anymore, right? I don't know this. I don't know what they're thinking.
What's your
It's a
youngest?
very important question.
What's your youngest?
My youngest, 31.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
But
my
I did
youngest
hear
is
that
25,
from somebody
right?
else. Somebody could check
They
it
have
for
kids?
sure.
I don't
Not
like
yet.
kids. I mean,
Not yet.
Penny Howard's Jasper, he
Jasper.
would definitely be able to say if that's going on. He's local, young guy.
But we in this room don't really know.
you know,
well, I do, one of my part-time jobs is I do clinical supervision at a mental health center in Newark, New Jersey. And they get referrals from the school system. Usually a child is referred, but it's always a family problem. 90 families have been referred so far this year.
Wait,
Issue.
you
In
mean
Newark.
starting in August of the school year?
Yeah.
Holy.
Some of them were kept over the summer, but there's 12 therapists and 90 families to deal with of severe kind of disorder going on. So one of the things we look at is, you know, if you're looking at mental health, there's the thing, first of all, your own self, and then there's your immediate environment. But we're seeing that what's called the macro environment is also a factor. What children feel about the world. Is the world a safe place? Is it a dangerous place? Is it chaotic? Is it stable? That's a factor in mental health. So we're seeing this as a factor that one of the things that's causing anxiety and sorrow in children and anger sometimes. Because adults aren't supposed to act like that. Adults are supposed to be admirable and trustworthy. And they're not seeing that. So I have direct observation of this, where it's not just how the child feels, it's not just what's going on in the family, it's also about what's going on in the world, because they have some awareness of it.
I wonder, is that comparable to the kind of awareness my generation had when we were living in fear of a nuclear bomb?
Yes.
And bomb shelters, and we get under our desks.
Yeah. Generalized anxiety.
And also today, I would think mostly children would be concerned about school shootings when they have to have
Yes,
drills
yes,
for that kind of thing.
that's part of what's part of their, I mean, that would be a layer behind the family, but, and that's often, they often feel unsafe there.
Right.
But also the world in general, what they see, what they hear, in terms of how the adults are acting. It creates some anxiety and sadness.
So they had these very real fears back in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, I guess. And what's the difference between why wasn't there, or was there just as much mental illness back then and just wasn't diagnosed? Or
Yeah,
what's the big difference in the sudden uptick in
yeah.
cases?
No, it's hard to quantify that, but I think nowadays, because of media and everything, there's a more general awareness of the conflicts that are going on. Rob?
I lived next to the San Diego Naval Base when I was about 8. We got under our desks.
Mhm.
My father pointed out that if they bomb that thing, it's not gonna, no help.
Yeah.
We had no fear. It was just something that adults did. I can remember a line of school kids waiting to go in the classroom, and we're all chanting, "We like Ike." God knows why. We didn't know shit, you know? But
Right.
I'm going, wow, okay, that's what kids think. And we're talking about, oh, they're stressed and fearful and stuff. I don't know, I was there and it never came up. Fight on the playground, okay, that's something, but the rest of this stuff.
I grew up in a town of 200, 40 miles west of here, outside of Cumberland. And we used to have those get under your desk drills. And the thought that occurred to me at the time was, why would anyone bomb this place?
Right.
We never did that. I was
Never?
out in western Ohio. Here's the difference though.
No one's bombing Ohio.
Even like you're saying, your dad said, well, it's not gonna help anyways. But the thing is this had only happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That didn't happen. Kids hadn't been killed by bombs in the United States. It hadn't happened. We just had a shooting last week. Kids it's gotta creep into their minds once in a while. You know, that was a small school in a little town in Middle Georgia. It wasn't a city. That was a small town.
But is it,
Yeah, it could happen here.
Judy?
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, do you think that there's a difference between children perceiving a distant enemy, a potential enemy, like way over there across that big ocean, and constant exposure on the news and
Yeah.
say their parents that, oh, those Republicans down the road, those Democrats down the road, kind of like if you expose a child to their parents fighting constantly.
Yeah.
It's kind of like their immediate surroundings, their neighborhood, their school, their everything they see on TV is like half the people are the bad guys and half the people are the good
Yeah.
guys.
Plus, I think in the early 50s, or the 50s and the early 60s, I was born in 1940. But even though one was aware of distant conflicts, and even though in my town there were Republicans and Democrats, and my family were Republican, so naturally I was a Republican, without knowing what the difference might be. Just it was a family loyalty thing. But there was also greater solidarity among the adults in my immediate environment. And Walter Cronkite was delivering the news. Entirely different general kind of emotional atmosphere. So even though there was conflict and we knew about wars and all that, it was generally more stable among the adults.
And he wasn't one of 50 voices delivering the news essentially 100 times a day.
Yeah,
Which I think in the 50s probably would have created anxiety too, if 17 different versions of Walter Cronkite were talking to you every few seconds
and saying different things.
and saying slightly different things, yeah. Confusing as well as that.
And that's the way it is.
Well, that's the way it is right now.
That was
Well,
Walter.
speaking of Carmel, I actually was raised in Carmel, Frostburg area.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And, but my parents were liberal without being political.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things, there was something called détente at one time. And one of my things my parents did is they got Soviet life delivered to their home. And it was, pro-Russian stuff, showing pictures of Russians walking around, pictures of Russian countryside or whatever. But my parents wanted us to think of Russians as humans. didn't want us to think of him as somebody, an enemy out there. And I think they did us a favor that way.
Okay.
Correct.
Well, let me ask then this final question. Is it possible to find a way out of the maze?
I think that's rhetorical. Are we moving on?
No, that's
Do you
it.
have it, what's your inner feeling about it, though? Do you have an inner feeling about whether it's possible to get out of the maze, or are we stuck with it now?
It's really good.
Depends what my mood is at the time.
Well, there's so many influences. And that, I mean, just what we have with Facebook this week, just with people, you know, posts not getting posted, seeing things that people say. And this is all over. I mean, I work, volunteer with some veterans, and, you know, I had a veteran yesterday, retired from the Navy, so I don't trust the government. And quite a few of them feel that way. These are guys that served in the military like I did. They don't trust the government. They'll say they don't trust. They think we should be totally isolationist. We should not be involved in any other countries' policies. Let them figure it out on their own.
Okay.
And you know, you and I were, when we were growing up, we grew up in the aftermath of World War II, where the United States was the most, well, because of our power, we had vanquished the Nazi Germany and the Japanese, you know, we had vanquished them. Of course, Russia had a big part of that too. But we were very successful.
Yeah.
And there wasn't much anti-American talk back then because we were the winners.
Yeah. Well, let me just point out, before we move on, that the difference between hope and despair. A person can lose their job and their house can burn down and their car could get stolen in the same day. But as long as they feel that things can get better, there's less risk of suicide. A person facing those same circumstances who feels like things cannot ever get better, that's called despair, and that's a high risk of suicide. So it's not so much what happens to a person as to how they feel about it and how they feel about life in general.
What's your reaction?
But, well, let me press on if I may. The preamble. The preamble consists of only one sentence, but it is the single most important sentence in all of U.S. history, because it states the entire and only purpose of the government that the people of the United States voted to impose on ourselves. This means we voted to govern ourselves. It is the only statement of national purpose that has ever been fully and hotly debated, voted on by the people of the U.S. in their towns, and ratified and enacted by the people of the United States. The single best book I've ever seen on the ratification process is this book. It's really thorough. So if you want to see how much controversy and hotly debated in the newspapers of the time, in the taverns, in the street corners, in the parlors, it was a hot topic, whether or not to vote for the new Constitution with its preamble. The preamble was also hotly debated. There was a debate about whether to put the word God in the preamble. The American people said no. we don't want a situation like in England where there's a Church of England that dominates the political and social scene. So the American people at the time said, no, we don't want the word God in the preamble. It has to be we the people, which was a huge thing at the time, and still is actually. And this was after many years of hardship, turmoil, bitter disagreements, and bloodshed. When we ratified our Constitution in 1788, we voted to use our hard-won liberty to bind ourselves to our national purpose, as stated in the preamble to our Constitution, and to the centralized but branched form of federal government, because that was the form that was thought best able to accomplish our national purposes. The body of the preamble is not, the Constitution is not an accident. That's the form of government that they thought would best be able to accomplish our national purpose stated in the preamble. The only official and legal purpose of our nation consists of 6 and only 6 equally important and mutually dependent goals. Bound together, the 6 goals are like the facets of our nation's most precious gem, our inherited national purpose, which is binding on and shared by all of us. So the preamble says, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense against a foreign enemy, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. In order to do those things, we do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. There are those terms: union, justice, tranquility, defense, general welfare, and liberty. 6 key ideas. But what comes before them are action words. We want to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. This is more complicated than it seems on the surface, but each of these words represents the solution to a specific problem that had existed in the colonies and then in the Confederacy. Our first Constitution was the Articles of Confederation, which there was no strong central power with ability to enforce anything. The Confederacy, the Continental Congress, would assess states a certain amount of money, so that the joint budget was funded by state governments. And that's the first time the United States of America was used to say who we are in the Articles of Confederation. The Congress would assess states a share of the expense. But nobody had any way to enforce anything.
They weren't forced to pay.
Not even and Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts was about some people who thought they didn't even want to pay the state. This is my money. They didn't want to pay the states, but there was no way to enforce anything in the Confederacy. It was all a voluntary act. And it didn't work. It failed miserably. So with each of these words, is intended to address a specific problem at the time, but the brilliance here is that each of these words also represents a general virtue of a good society. Absolute genius.
A month ago, I stood in James Madison's office at lunch. I stood in James Madison's office at Montpelier where this was written.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was awful. There was hotly debated in the Continental Congress and in the streets, in the towns, everywhere.
You know something different? Because I read, there's another book, A Few Honest Men, about the summer of 1787. Something unique about what they did was those men, it was all men, but they were in that room all summer. And anyone could say anything they wanted. And the stipulation was, whatever you say in here does not leave this room. We're gonna say whatever we think might be a good idea, and we're gonna talk about it. It's not gonna be discussed outside this room, because some of the ideas are gonna be good, some of them aren't gonna be. We're gonna figure out what we think works.
And the other thing I wanted to bring up with regard to that is the purpose, the brilliance of we the people was that the Constitution was not ratified by state legislatures or the Congress.
That's right.
It had to depend on every eligible voter.
Every state had to approve it. The people in every
The
state.
people in every state, before the state could ratify it, but it was not ratified by state legislatures or the Congress. It was given to the people. That was something brand new in history. Rob, were you going to say something?
You're giving me the creeps. I'm listening to the beautiful words, and they're sitting there in the Madison or wherever they're sitting, and they've got slavery staring them
Yeah.
right in the face, and every
They weren't people.
clause
Yes.
in that sentence
Right.
is contradicted.
But to me, the genius of this preamble is also that there's nothing in the wording that supports exclusionism. In other words, there's nothing in here that says, we, the white Christian males of the United States.
He didn't define the membership.
It didn't say we the men.
Yeah, it didn't
It
say
said we the
that.
white, we the landowners.
We the landowners. It said we the people. So the language, yes, there have been all kinds of exclusionism in the United States over the history, but in the words themselves, there is no exclusion.
So by saying it as we redefine, and we really redefine what people meant. Black people weren't people.
And women weren't.
And
Women weren't people.
Yeah.
Women were-
Forgot about them.
Most immigrants weren't people.
Indentured
And
servants.
so that
Well,
is
it's only
the moral
100 years
challenge
ago.
of.
100 years ago, women
Right.
got the right to vote, or demanded, secured their right to vote. But if you look at each of these words, you can see it wasn't just addressing a problem at the time. It was leaving the door open for further development.
But also realize, he says, after many years of hardship, turmoil, bitter disagreements, bloodshed, but it doesn't end with the Constitution. There's still hardship, turmoil, bitter disagreements.
Yeah,
Bloodshed, but that could occur a generation later with the Civil War. It'd be
Right.
more blood.
right.
And that was in the effort to become a more perfect union. you could argue.
Exactly. These are ongoing processes.
That's the best argument I've heard for the Civil War, to not feel bad about it, is we're the first country to actually fight a war over slavery. Most didn't bother.
And
They
what
either
we
changed the
talking-
law, like England, which was kind of amazing and it shocked people,
That's amazing.
because it was a trick.
What are we
They cut the
talking about
king.
here, Tracy?
But the-
It's a lack of domestic tranquility.
Yeah.
Right now there is.
But look at this too, that what it's saying here is that the government has a role to play in forming a more perfect union. The government has a role to play in establishing justice. The government has a role to play in ensuring tranquility, a role to play in providing for the common defense. And John Jay said, against foreign enemies, foreign attackers. The government has a responsibility to promote the general welfare, the general well-being, and the blessings
I
of
could
the...
argue about that. You know, the oath, everybody swears when they take office, is that they will support the common
Yes.
against enemies both foreign and domestic.
Yeah,
But that's
right.
that's true. And I took that oath.
And so it's not just foreign, but
But the
also
oath
domestic.
came later after this. But that's true. As an Army officer, I took that oath.
I think if we are to listen to what you're saying and adopt this preamble state of mind, where we pay more attention to the purpose, our unified purpose as a nation, we should also not let ourselves get too distracted about the personalities that drafted it and their hypocrisy. It's the same mistake we make when we're choosing partisanship over a truth that's inherent in the preamble. It's a difference between having winning or pointing the finger as our main purpose
Right.
and looking at the truth of what the words actually say.
Yeah.
It could be a distraction.
Yeah,
to
that's
say,
the
"Oh, they were
ideas versus the
hypocritical."
reality, but there's a certain amount of idealism in here, that these are ideals too. They're social ideals that they decided was virtues of a good society. The other thing I want to make before we move on is that each of these is interdependent. In other words, you can't have a more perfect union without justice, tranquility, defense, general welfare, and liberty. And you can't have justice without a more perfect union, tranquility, et cetera, et cetera. They're
brilliant.
all interdependent.
Pure brilliance.
Huh?
Pure brilliance.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm stunned.
And
Uh,
I think, the very wording of to form a more perfect union right away says, this is aspirational.
Yes.
This is what we're working
Yeah.
for. They don't say perfect.
Right.
They don't say
right,
perfect.
right.
Because there is no
Perfect.
static perfect union, because
It's
we're always changing.
always
The Congress that's
It's amazing.
the convention that initially considered drafting the Constitution was partly because the Confederacy was failing, it had failed. And so the idea of a more perfect union was to, part one, correct the mistakes in the Confederate form, and number two, to aspire to a future. So that these are not once and done things. These are processes that occur in a society if the society wants to do it. But that's,
They, at the end of the summer and the fall, when they wrote the final document, there was no Bill of Rights.
Correct.
They didn't want a Bill of Rights
Right.
because, well, one, they were just exhausted.
yeah,
It's a hot summer like this one. They've been there all summer, but they wanted the country to be able to adapt
yeah,
to the situation as time went on.
yeah,
They wanted our Constitution to allow the government to adapt to new situations.
and there was a debate about whether to amend it with the Bill of Rights. Some people said, well, if we're giving all the power to the people, they have to guarantee their own rights.
Yeah.
And somebody else said, well, but if you don't spell it out, people aren't gonna, so like spelling it out was a way to shortcut to say, oh, by the way, this is part of our, rights and duties and responsibilities and privileges as people in the United States, that we do have a Bill of Rights. And that was important because of abuses of the monarchy in England.
Yep. It's important to have.
Yeah. So let me move on. This is a little Thousands of people suffered and died horribly in the War for Independence. 40,000 soldiers died and 6,000 were wounded.
Intended to die because they didn't survive, right?
So that we could have the luxury of democratic and purposeful self-governance. Democratic and purposeful. Whether we know it or not, or whether we like it or not, we all share in our one and only voted on national purpose. Our shared national purpose actually is and actually should be the foundation of shared national values. Unity based in truth. We all can be on the same page because we all have been given the same page to be on. So let me move on to some observations and implications here for us. Again, the preamble is the only statement of purpose that has ever been voted on by the people of the United States. Our branched form of federal government is the only form of government that has ever been voted on by the people of the United States. So our purpose and our form of government are the only ones that have ever been voted on. Ever. Various forms of authoritarianism, conservatism, liberalism, and libertarianism have been strong influences in Western history. These ideologies have frequently been in deadly conflict as they have attempted to dominate Western politics and economies. Those ideologies have served their purpose. They have shown us the strengths and weaknesses of very different ways of life so that we can choose what we can choose to live by, that we can choose to live by. But they are all bankrupt now. They can't help us anymore. Now they are all just dividing us. The good news is that we actually don't need them anymore. So this should make me a lot of friends, right? We don't need those ideologies anymore because the amazing genius of our preamble integrates and balances the best features of each ideology in one sentence. Because of this, each one of our customary ideologies is non-constitutional and sometimes even anti-constitutional when they work against our national purpose and democratic form of government. If we are faithful to our preamble and federal form of governance, we could all be members of the Preamble Party, in which all of us would work together, using our democratic government to fulfill the 6 goals of our national purpose. This is the vision that the founders voted for. Only the preamble and the branched form of federal self-governance make their vision and their votes count. Those who don't like the preamble could form their own non-preamble or anti-preamble parties. This would be a bitter but eye-opening realization for us. Maybe it's not too late for us to at least try to fulfill the founders' hopes and dreams for their posterity, which includes all of us. Do you think it's too late? Trey?
The founders.
Wait, Trey had.
Sorry, I snuck my hand up. Okay, so I am drawn to what I think is the meat here. And I want to ask you to describe or explain more about, because of this, each one of our customary ideologies above is non-constitutional and sometimes even anti-constitutional. So I'd like for you to give some examples of that.
It's when they work against. Right.
So the only
in
official.
authoritarianism, and
Right.
I think that we can all out this room, like it's a fairly
Yeah.
Democrat-leaning, in the traditional politics,
Yeah.
left-leaning group
But we're not.
gathered here.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear about non-constitutional and anti-constitutional values that we
What
maybe
strikes me about
unconsciously-
this question
Yeah.
is that we're not trained and taught to think in terms of the preamble. We're taught, we learn growing up Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, as though those are the things you have to choose from. So to me, the premise is mistaken because we haven't been taught about the preamble in our schools. And I'm not sure anybody, I mean, when I was learning this stuff, I was amazed at how much I didn't know because there was no background for it. But it's an extreme. In other words, the preamble takes all of these ideologies, chooses the best of each, and integrates and balances them in one political philosophy. Whereas the danger is, if you're authoritarian, you think there's not much room for democracy there. And if you are conservative, the main goal is social stability at any cost. That's what conservative is about. It's about maintaining social stability. You can read Edmund Burke. He was the philosopher on this one. Liberalism
No,
is
stick with the original plan.
I'm sorry?
Conservative means stick with the original plan.
Yeah, if you
No
try to
changes
improve
needed.
things, you're probably just gonna make things worse.
I mean, on a sort of practical everyday level, like where might I be walking around in the world unconscious that some of my beliefs, values, or what I think are my purposes are not in alignment with the preamble? That's,
Yeah.
help me out there.
And to me, the mistake here is not that there's anything wrong with the good parts of each of those ideologies. For example, our government is authoritarian in the sense that we have imposed on ourselves a form of government. So that's our authority. So it is authoritarian. If you want to change the Constitution, there is a process where you can try to shoot it out of people's hands. But the point is that the Constitution is our authority in terms of civil life and government. So that's authoritarian. We're conservative in the sense that we want to preserve the best features of our society while not being married to the worst features. That we're willing to say, well, yeah, there is something worthwhile here. What is it? My point is that probably the most important one is the preamble in the Constitution. That's worth conserving. Mm-hmm. I'm not willing to give that up. Liberalism was about a reaction to the social system in medieval Europe where individuals didn't really have an opportunity to do anything other than what their parents did. Liberalism was the new idea that human beings as individuals are worthwhile and that we can develop individuals. Individuals can determine the course of their own life if they have the right opportunities like education and health and stuff like that. In other words, the individual started to matter. That was the liberalism comes from the Latin word liber, which means free.
Yeah.
So that was the counterbalance to the arch conservatism of the Middle Ages. And then libertarianism takes one idea and says, this is the whole thing. It's more important than everything else, my liberty. But we used our liberty to vote to manage ourselves with a form of government. So each of these ideologies has something good to say, but if you take any one of them as an extreme, they destroy the fabric of society. So that's why the preamble is brilliant. It actually blends the best of all these historic ideologies into one sentence. It almost makes me feel maybe there is a God.
Speaking of that, maybe there is a God. You were talking earlier about despair. And I remember one time when we were talking psychology, you said one of the antidotes to depression is if you have a purpose, if your life has a purpose, you know, you could I know when I suffered horrible traumas, one of the things that kept me going was that I have a purpose, and I knew what my purpose was to a large extent. And it occurred to me the whole time you're talking that the reason this country is so screwed up is because we've lost our purpose, the preamble as a country. We've lost it. And worse, if we've made a religion or God out of our different sub-ideologies, conservative, liberalism, it's like we have conflicting purposes. If we don't put a joint purpose together as a whole,
Yes.
we're a disordered whole.
Yeah, and that's why it's
At
so
war with itself.
brilliant, because it doesn't say authoritarianism is always bad. No, we have an authority. It's our Constitution. Conservative is always bad. No, it isn't. It wants to preserve certain things, to conserve the good things. Liberalism isn't always bad. No, it's good. It recognizes the worth and dignity of every individual. And libertarianism isn't totally bad because it says, wait a minute, freedom does matter. Now, I think that there's always a psychological basis for these ideologies, especially with authoritarianism and libertarianism. It's more of a psychological stance than a rational stance. Nevertheless, they're out here. But to me, it's like the preamble doesn't negate any of those, but it brings them together in a way that's complete genius. And it's not taught in the schools.
I wanted to take what Judy opened is the genius that you're talking about taking the best from each of the ideologies and constantly discussing them. And what I'm hearing what you're saying is missing is the discussion has ranged so far into competing ideologies
Right.
that we can't talk directly about the values.
Yeah.
We're literally debating which ideology as opposed to what is the value we're trying to talk about here.
Yeah.
Right.
We're trying to play tic-tac, not even tic. We're trying to play either or when we don't know what the game is.
And the
The game
preamble,
is the values.
the
Oh, I-
preamble integrates.
I was raised in a very,
Yeah.
conservative family, particularly my mother. And my mother's family background, they came over from Poland. And conservatism, even on like a personal level, you saw it reflected in good ideologies. They wanted to conserve a beautiful, warm, homey family interaction, children at the table. They wanted to conserve that. They wanted to conserve the traditional family recipes, which I love to conserve. There's beauty in all the different ideologies. There's also pathology when they go to extremes. So like when the family wanted to conserve its family reputation at all costs and hide all the dirty little secrets, people suffered. So there's beauty, and I think the preamble is great. It does the same thing for politics. It picks out what's good, and it gives us a purpose. We could all say, oh yeah, you have that value, I do too.
Which is where I'm hoping to go with it in a slightly more practical sense is when I discuss with people from page one, it's like, does this increase our unity? It's a purpose-driven question. And it's open-ended. And now you can say, as a conservative, yes, this, blah, blah, blah. But then you can say, it's like, well, but this has some problems. And you can go down to each one. Does it establish justice? And justice is clearly a for-all statement. I mean, the point of expanding the meaning of the word person is person keeps getting bigger.
Well, think of the pledge with liberty and justice
For
for
all.
all.
Justice isn't, because for the king, justice was I get what I want. One guy had all the justice.
Yeah, and that
we
was
just
an
keep
early Mesopotamian notion of justice. Justice is when you give the wealthier party what they want. Code of Hammurabi.
So really, it's real.
What got me
Sounds too recent.
What got me into politics is when George W. Bush decided to invade Iraq because he didn't like Iraqis, apparently, and wanted to steal their oil. But, and I found that it was just terrible to go out and shoot people just because you don't like their politics and want to steal from them. And to me, the judge is this human? I mean, does it recognize other people's humanity? If you don't recognize other people's humanity, there's something wrong right there before we even,
But that's a liberal idea, yeah.
I know.
But you
I
could.
told you I was liberal.
And if you took this into the value statement, you could go into, is this common defense? Iraq War, just, you can be very specific, is this common defense? And then you get really rapidly into, who's getting this? And it would break down pretty quickly into, okay, some oil companies might get some benefits, who might not, who might get some benefits.
There's
Where
always
are we
been,
going? We get into facts, we get into, yeah. But
there's
it
always
opens
a
the door.
commercial.
I think liberty and we can go back to and humanity is more important actually than defense. You know, I've gone out there with the Quakers and, you know, we gotta stop spending money on defense and putting it into education and healthcare and stuff like that.
You see, the thing to me it's most amazing, and by the way, there was a shift in defense policy where preemptive strikes were considered part of the defense
Defense,
against
right.
foreign powers.
Right.
It was also a cover for expansion of commercial interests.
Right.
But we do preemptive strikes against people we think might attack us. So that became part of defense strategy, is the legitimation of the preemptive strike. Before somebody actually attacks, you can take them out if you think that they might be wanting to take you.
And
But again, let me just say quickly, to me, this idea of an integrated and balanced set of values is really a new idea. So if you talk to people about this, they're not going to understand what you're saying. It's not something they've heard before.
How did they mean the word all, do you think? When they say all,
They did.
what, liberty and justice for all?
They
That
didn't
was
say
the
that.
Pledge of Allegiance.
Oh.
Yeah.
Much later, yeah.
That's something we say at
They
the
said
town
we.
council every,
and that comes
for
from the Civil
all,
War.
except those we don't like.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah, all they had was the we.
And I think
But-
too often our government defines enemies as people who don't agree with them.
Yeah, there's different ways to define that. Sam, you were going to say something?
No, I guess just, you said that presenting these 6 values would be foreign to people, and I'm not sure I agree with that. I think
Okay.
a lot of people would wrap up whatever ideology that they adhere to and policy and political goals that they strive to in these 6 values, that justice and defense and welfare and liberty are
Mm-hmm.
subjective terms that don't have a common definition. They're not ordained from any higher power. They were written down by a couple guys in Philadelphia, and we fight over them to this day.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing process. To me, it's an ongoing process, and it's a question of whether we have goodwill or bad will in terms of Rob.
Earlier, at some point, we discussed, like, what are we gonna do? We're divided, can we ever undivide?
Uh-huh.
And I think the preamble is the bringing together. And you were saying it's like, oh, yeah, they won't know what you're talking about. I agree with you that everybody knows what you're talking about. When you read that, you're like, oh, yeah, I'm for that, even though, but the bad thing we got is Jonestown.
Mm-hmm.
And I have
Guy
yet
had
to
it,
see.
drinking Kool-Aid.
I have yet to see, there's a bunch of people that survived that. They either weren't there, you know, they hadn't left or something. I have never seen what they felt like after Jonestown.
Yeah.
So I believe after this election, we're gonna see a bunch of after Jonestown people. And, this is what I got to show
So
them.
let me just,
Wow.
there was one thing, there was a number of things I didn't put in here, but one of the things was, to me, in a preamble society, we are always looking for ways to improve on each of these concepts. And how do we do that? To me, there's no substitute for knowledge. Like if we want to say we want to improve justice by doing this, that, or the other thing, it shouldn't just be based on what I want, my opinion, my psychology. It should be, what are the data? How does this actually working? Pragmatic democracy uses knowledge and data to decide law and policy. We can say, well, the libertarian would say, if everybody has absolute liberty, we'll have the best possible society. Okay, can you define your terms? And are there any data to support that? Or is just, a lot of our political philosophy thinking is, I think, more psychological than rational. But that's part of the problem. Sorry, Trey.
Well, and we are, right? Humans are psychological beings. We're not
Mhm.
particularly
Yeah.
rational. And
Yeah.
expend energy to dive into the
Yeah.
rational. I was recently listening to a BBC story on the news about how elections are happening, not just here, but all over the world, and people who are analyzing election behavior are saying that charisma
Mm-hmm.
is really
History.
coming
Yeah.
to be the number one
Yeah.
thing that makes
Yeah.
them electable and
Right.
get elected. Charisma, not best policies,
Right.
not this and that.
Logical argument.
So we are, as a body, right,
It's
in the
still,
aggregate, we are responding to the psychology,
Yeah.
not the rational.
it's
Where-
still,
How do we work toward
yeah.
getting
I
better at
think, I think Socrates ought to be taught in the schools too. That there's a
Yeah, what you're
difference
describing as
between
sophistry.
winning and truth. And as long as people value winning above all, truth is gonna get pushed out. And if unity is more important than truth, then what makes you think things are gonna turn out well? Unity without truth is, people running toward the edge of a cliff. Nazi Germany, they were united in their truth, but it wasn't true, and it wasn't gonna work. Hitler was wrong. If you get rid of the Jews, it's not gonna make Germany better. And if you get rid of the gypsies and the homosexuals, it's not gonna make Germany better, but that was the line that he was selling, and he was a charismatic speaker. So, truth, we haven't mastered this thing yet. Like how to integrate unity and truth without damaging either one. We don't know yet. But to me, that's part of a preamble process. Like to think about that rather than all of our, getting up in arms about the differences that are based on half-truths most of the time anyway.
I think a lot of times people don't want to face the truth.
Yeah, what was it Nicholson said? You can't handle the truth.
Yeah,
So you
exactly.
mentioned Socrates, so I read the biographies of Jefferson, Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. They all went to, I guess it was Princeton, and those early colleges, and guess what they studied? Greeks.
Classics.
Socrates, Plato.
Yeah, they
So
were
a lot of these
familiar.
ideas,
And Aristotle, they were
all
familiar with those
deep-seated
concepts.
ideas.
About, especially Plato in the Republic talks about the nature of government and so forth. But they were familiar with the classics.
yeah.
Well, let me just show you this book here. This one is called Political Parties Before the Constitution. Published by University of North Carolina Press. It's kind of a classic. And this one, We the People, is the economic origins of the Constitution. It was complicated. It was complicated. I'm amazed that anything happened. that came out of that whole thing. It's just amazing to me. And it's so saddening that it's not taught in the schools. My history class in high school was, well, we had the Pilgrims, and then we had Thanksgiving, and then we had the Revolutionary War, and then we had the Civil War and World War II, and that's American history.
We wouldn't have had, this would not have succeeded if the Continental Congress, if that had not been such a disaster, we wouldn't have had a constitution, because the southern states, they were just formed their own country.
Or the individual states.
But what was
Yeah,
sold
that
to
was-
them is,
yeah.
look, we're gonna be stronger if we stay together, and we have to
Yeah.
compromise.
We need a national government that has power to maximize the critical mass of the whole nation, that can pass laws. There was no national judiciary under the Confederacy. There was no set of laws governing relations between states.
Nope.
Or between the states that had criminal laws, but if a state had a beef with another state, there was no place to take it. So that was the idea of justice, too, was part of that notion. We need a national justice system where people can bring cases against the government, states can bring cases against each other, and people can bring cases where there's a constitutional issue involved. That didn't exist during the Confederacy. That they said, no, we need a national system of justice. We need a Department of Justice. We need to take this seriously as a way of minimizing conflict and promoting, ensuring domestic tranquility.
That was it. So the big economic thing, one of the big economic things was foreign trade.
Yeah.
Because before, each state had its own
Its own,
tariff
Yeah.
office. You know, some states had a tariff on this and another state didn't, so states were competing with each other.
Right.
And
And they were being used by foreign interests to attack each other and compete with each other.
Yeah, so it wasn't a real union there. It was
they knew.
the first real association through the First Continental Congress was something called the Articles of Association, where, because of acts that Parliament had imposed on the colonies, things had become intolerable in terms of, for example, because of the Boston Tea Party, Parliament said we're going to close Boston Harbor
Yep.
until they pay for the tea they threw overboard.
Right.
That led to the Acts of Association, which included a boycott of British goods, including a boycott of the British slave trade. So, and that eventually led to Parliament, and then there was the shots at Lexington and Concord. It led Parliament to declare that the colonies were in rebellion, and then troops moved in, and that's when the war started.
But Massachusetts needed Virginia's help. Virginia was the largest colony,
Yes,
and they couldn't do it without Virginia. That's where the compromises started coming.
and that's what
Because
the,
Massachusetts had to keep courting Virginia. You gotta come and help us, you know?
yeah, let's form a more perfect union.
We don't get our asses kicked because you let us.
But they had to have Virginia's help. It was the largest colony, it was the most prosperous.
They all needed each other.
And so the only way they could survive was, so that's where they had to start compromising.
Because if they didn't, then Britain would have had a divide and conquer policy. Let's show favoritism to this one, we'll set up some rivalries within the colonies, and that way we can control them all.
And Massachusetts couldn't buy and sell.
Right. And I think it's what we're saying, the parties are a sense doing it, even media outlets